A little over a year ago, I did a couple of videos talking about Emil Pagliarulo, lead writer for Starfield and Bethesda's Fallout games, and writer for a couple factions in Oblivion and Skyrim. The point of these videos was to talk about what I believe to be a significant problem within Bethesda that is resulting in their games getting increasingly worse with each new release. I want to make it clear in advance that, despite the title, I hold no personal animosity towards Emil. For some reason on the internet, people seem to view criticism of someone as though it's nothing more than pure unfiltered hatred, which is just really weird. I don't think he's a bad guy. In fact, I'm fairly certain he's probably a really chill dude. That said, I do think he's someone who has been promoted far beyond his capability. That is to say, I don't think he's a skilled writer in the slightest. I'm sorry if this comes across as rude or inconsiderate, but I don't really care how good a person may be when they're doing massive damage through their failures as a writer to a franchise I like. This was the point I was making in those videos, using evidence both from the games he's worked on, as well as a speech he made talking about writing for games, a speech that was an aimless, rambling mess. Since then, there have been a few incidents that are relevant to this discussion, at least in regards to Emil in particular, and I wanted to cover them. First is the now infamous tweet where Emil retcons the male playable character from Fallout 4, Nate, into the opening cinematic of the original Fallout game, making him an accomplice to a war crime who laughs about the murder of an unarmed prisoner, thereby making Nate a war criminal.
Given the great vibes recently, and the millions of amazing Fallout fans, that's you, I feel like the time is right to finally share an unknown link between Fallout 1 and Fallout 4. Remember the Fallout 1 opening movie? Annexation of Canada? Same guy. No, not the shooter. This unambiguously makes Nate a war criminal. The first point I want to talk about is the fact that Emil seems unable to read a situation. Now, I'm not one to trot out the media literacy criticism, because most people who use it now are self-important dickheads who use it to dismiss everyone who doesn't read every piece of media as communist or anti-capitalist. But this might actually be a genuine instance of someone being unable to comprehend or understand what is happening on screen. It's a fairly short clip, and it's really straightforward. It's a military recruitment ad that shows an unarmed and restrained prisoner on his knees being executed by a power-armored soldier, with his companion laughing about it. The executioner even shoots the corpse a second time as a joke. Now, this is something that is so obviously bad on its face that it shouldn't need explaining. But people like Emil exist. The point of the clip on its own is to help establish the dark tone of the world of Fallout, even before the bombs drop. This is one of the first things you see in the original Fallout game. This isn't someone who is sympathetic. This isn't someone you're supposed to identify with. This is not someone you're supposed to be rooting for or cheering on. This is meant to be seen as a horrific, disgusting act. It is meant to be utterly revolting. Tourists can cope and sneed about Fallout being a comedy all they want, but it never has been a comedy, and was originally dark and serious before Bethesda fucked it up and turned it into a clown show. No, rare Easter eggs or comedic moments don't turn the entire franchise into a comedy. Fallout is a dark game with dark themes. In fact, they were originally going to use the GURPS system for their game, but the creator denied them because they didn't want their system to be associated with something they saw as repulsive, the unambiguous execution of an unarmed prisoner of war. How is anyone supposed to feel about Nate, the family man who fears for his family's safety and is just looking for his kidnapped son, now being recontextualized to be a horrific war criminal, laughing about the murder of an innocent man? That's also the whole point of this scene. It's meant to be grim and horrific. The whole point is to set the dark tone of the world of Fallout. The prisoner being executed was either captured or had surrendered and posed no threat whatsoever. He was a prisoner of war, yes, but that doesn't mean he deserves execution. Further, this is during the annexation of Canada. He was likely nothing more than someone defending his homeland. Further still, the fact that American soldiers were committing war crimes like this, but worse, that this was being filmed and they had no concerns about this and even waved at the camera,
and this is aired on television between car commercials, is a testament to the state of the world prior to the bombs dropping. Emil saw this, and didn't take any of that in, and thought he could force his OC in there without the slightest understanding of what this moment represents, or what it means to have this as part of Nate's history. Worse, he thought that clarifying, "No, not the shooter," absolved the other person in the situation. He knew enough that shooting an unarmed prisoner was bad, but he apparently didn't realize that being an accomplice to a war crime and laughing about the murder of an innocent man was also bad. Emil almost seems to be rejoicing in the fact that Nate is now a part of this reprehensible act, rather than understanding just how bad of a mark this is on his character. This alone is quite revealing to his thought process when it comes to writing, as well as the lore and canon of this franchise, and certain other design choices make a lot more sense as a result. There's a little thought or consideration between actions and events within the world. It's largely just shallow ideas they think are neat that get strung together to create a world and story. Wouldn't it be cool if Nate was one of the guys in the intro to Fallout 1? Seemingly without a moment of consideration of what that meant for the character. Even if killing a restrained, unarmed prisoner of war wasn't a war crime, you still have a video where a man is struggling against his bindings, isn't a threat, unable to defend himself, and is killed, and a soldier laughing about it, who is supposedly Nate now, which still reflects poorly on him as a person. The fact that Emil entirely failed to consider this is absolutely insane to me. It almost comes across as a lack of conscience, that he viewed this as little more than pixels moving on a screen, as opposed to a moment of storytelling that should be seen as utterly repulsive for the characters involved. Now, as I mentioned, he did retract this, which brings me to my next point.
I wanted to share what I thought was a cool Fallout tidbit without realizing how divisive it might be. I should have. Not every bit of Fallout info I share is automatically canon. Nate is not a war criminal.
This is obviously some premium grade cope. Emil, the issue isn't that it was divisive. Divisive would be if a significant change were to be made to something that splits the fandom. Something like The Last Jedi or, Bethesda Fallout games. The information wasn't divisive, it was revealing of how little thought you put into your writing by just randomly declaring Nate to have been an accomplice in a war crime and laughing about someone being murdered without even realizing you had done this or the implication it had on your own character that you made for your game. It wasn't divisive, it was just shit. The next thing I want to touch upon is an issue of revisionist history regarding the existing lore. It's the issue of shoving new characters into existing canon for no good reason. This is the kind of thing you see in bad fanfictions, where someone's original character is put into some key historical event or becomes significant to the main characters somehow. This is a cheap, lazy, and deceptive tactic to legitimize the new lore by connecting it to the original, as though the new lore cannot stand upon its own merits, but requires that connection to the original in order to be seen as legitimate. No one who worked on the original Fallout ever intended for this random war criminal to be the protagonist of a future Fallout game. Emil's unknown connection between Fallout 1 and Fallout 4 is little more than him poaching a moment from the original game and recontextualizing it to fit his own narrative without even understanding what this moment in Fallout 1 even meant. As I said, it's a form of trying to legitimize Bethesda's work on the franchise by intertwining their new lore with the old for no good reason, which I hate. This isn't even the first time they've done this either, nor will it be the last. To give another example of this revisionist history, the Brotherhood of Steel in the original Fallout was a relatively small faction, being confined to a single bunker on the west coast. They were technophile isolationists. They hated outsiders, and sent any who bugged them on a literal suicide mission and laughed about it. By the time of Fallout 3, the tone had shifted radically, with them becoming the de facto good guys. You can give all the lore excuses you want for this, but the fact remains that there was a massive and unnecessary shift in the tone regarding this faction, seemingly to turn them into the heroes of the wasteland. The original lore seemed to only be considered so far as making an excuse for why things had changed, with a Brotherhood outcast faction that stayed true to the Brotherhood ideals, while having no substance as a faction within the world. They were nothing more than set dressing, seemingly existing to placate fans of the original, that the Brotherhood hadn't actually changed, it was just a small group that did. The issue of both the tonal shift as well as the radical changes to the Brotherhood is exacerbated by Fallout 76 and the revisionist history it introduces regarding the Brotherhood. When Fallout 76 was first announced, being a game on the East Coast, featuring the Brotherhood of Steel, and is now the earliest point in the timeline we've seen in-game, aside from Fallout 4's short intro section, a major point of contention for many people was the fact that the Brotherhood existed in a place they shouldn't. Between Fallout 3 and Fallout 76, both putting the Brotherhood on the East Coast, the Brotherhood has been turned into a continental powerhouse when they never should have been. Remember, this was a group of isolationists. They hated outsiders because they thought advanced technology in the hands of ignorant people is what led to the apocalypse in the first place. How has this faction grown to be this big? Instead of properly addressing criticism and fixing the mistake, Bethesda instead contrived an excuse so they didn't have to correct their fuck-up. The founding members of the Brotherhood just so happened to have a satellite that just so happened to allow them to communicate with people on the complete other side of the country, and they just so happened to have contacted a Bethesda original character that was written to have been friends with a legacy character, the founder of the Brotherhood of Steel. This is very obviously cheap, lazy, awful writing on its own, because it's nothing more than an excuse for Bethesda to keep pushing the Brotherhood as the most important and iconic faction, as well as trying to legitimize their own additions to the lore that outright break and contradict it. For many people, this might actually have been their first time seeing the quality of his input on the Fallout franchise, without it being filtered through gameplay and a lens of potential fanboyism for the franchise. Stuff like this is why people like me are critical of Emil. About a year ago, Pathetic Cuck Never Knows Best tried to frame this criticism as though Emil is just some game developer that was randomly and unfairly targeted, and that a bunch of people, myself included, were essentially lying about him. But Emil has come out numerous times and has directly talked about things he's worked on. No one would really know who he was if he didn't do stuff like this and reveal both his lack of skill and his mindset on writing, both of which goes a long way to explaining why the quality of these games is declining with each release. Yes, it is true that not every piece of writing in these games was done by him. I don't think Emil is directly responsible for something like Kid on a Fridge. But when you're the lead writer on the project, or if you're the project lead, that means you're pretty fucking high up on the totem pole. I'll come back to this in a bit with the next set of tweets. To round out this first incident, I want to point out the lack of awareness Emil has in regards to the power his position grants him. As the lead writer on these games, he essentially has word of God power over the franchise. Whatever he claims is true or canon automatically is based on the fact that, in his own words, he's the Fallout guy. The credits of these games list him as the lead writer. Now of course someone higher than him, such as Todd Howard, could override him on these decisions, but the fact remains he has the power and influence to rewrite and change things on a whim, based on what he says about this franchise. It's really weird that the current lead writer of a franchise would be completely unaware of the weight his words have when speaking on that franchise and providing information about it. He even fucks up his retraction by saying he wanted to share a Fallout tidbit, implying it was more than headcanon. If this wasn't intended to be taken as canon, then it's less of a Fallout tidbit and more just you sharing an idea you had or your own headcanon. Worse yet, look at the original tweet again. Nothing in that tweet even implies that this wasn't canon. If anything, it seems like it was specifically meant to be taken as canon. It is presented as though it's fact, and he only changed his tune when he realized he fucked up immensely. I mean, he's outright stating it. I feel like the time is right to finally share an unknown link between Fallout 1 and Fallout 4. Remember the Fallout 1 opening movie? Annexation of Canada? Same guy. That's a firm statement of fact, not a headcanon, not an idea that was considered but scrapped, nothing of the sort. It should be getting more and more clear why I don't think he's qualified for his job, and why I think he's a significant part of Bethesda's games getting worse and worse with each release. Now once again, game development is a collaborative effort, especially at this scale. Not every single problem with these games are directly ML's fault, and as we learned from Will Shen's GDC presentation, which I'll be covering in a separate video, the rot within Bethesda is company-wide. While it's impossible to say how much power he has over the games he makes, I assume the lead writer would essentially be the top dog when it comes to writing in these games, and therefore many things that go into the game would have to go through him. If that's not the case, he's still a friend of Todd Howard, and pretty high up in the company regardless, and would likely have sway based on his word alone. Unless of course we're to believe that one of the top guys at Bethesda has no influence, and the title of lead writer is meaningless within the company. Someone significant enough to be given a producer credit in the Fallout show alongside Todd Howard, but still so low on the totem pole, someone so insignificant that he has no real say over the writing in the games he's a lead writer for. This is effectively what Never Knows Best was arguing in his hit piece, that ML wasn't a significant factor in the writing or lore for these games, and those of us that were critical of him were just unfairly targeting a random game developer. Well, thanks to a set of tweets from him last year, we know that's not true. Just a small selection from his tweets here. But that pales next to the privilege of being the person whose job and passion it is to keep Fallout lore intact, whether advising the TV showrunners, the great devs on Fallout 76, our external partners, or even folks down the hall. It's the honor of a lifetime. Occasionally I'll read something to the effect of, "He doesn't give a shit about the lore." That is such an insane statement. Just ask the people I've annoyed over the years with my hardcore adherence to the canon. Mistakes and discrepancies kill me, as they should. He further adds, Jonathan Nolan and company have captured the essence of Fallout so well, beyond the exciting, often humorous cautionary tale, it challenges us to question what it even means to be alive. Where to even start? I suppose the best place to start would be with the confirmation that it is, in fact, ML's job to keep the Fallout lore intact. See, when I said he should be fired before, that was due to the failures in the writing in Bethesda games, particularly with Starfield, Skyrim, and Fallout 3 and 4, of which ML is the lead writer for all of these games except Skyrim, of which he was still a significant contributor towards, and he was also the design director of Starfield. Knowing he's been the one in charge of the Fallout lore makes this worse by orders of magnitude. Once again, making games is a collaborative effort, but it's literally his job, by his own admission, to keep the lore intact. So if anyone else on the team fucks something up, it is his job to have it corrected. This is something he has failed to do. In fact, he even says that mistakes and discrepancies kill him. If this is the case, then why are there so many retcons and so much contradictory lore in your games? This also applies to them completely changing a faction for no good reason. Keep in mind too, there are massive lore issues in singular games, not just massive retcons across the franchise. In fact, they end up contradicting their own lore they themselves created for their own games. Why does Bethesda always double down or come up with excuses for these problems, rather than acknowledging them and fixing them, or alternatively, trying to prevent more in the future? The classic example is the kid in a fridge quest in Fallout 4. Fallout 1 established that ghouls need water to survive, and it's implied they need food as well. This is further supported by New Vegas. Fallout 4 retcons this by saying they don't need food or water through the kid in a fridge quest, where a ghoul child has been trapped in a fridge for 210 years. That's already bad on its own, but it gets worse than that. See, Fallout 4 contradicts itself multiple times on this matter. In addition to Kid in a Fridge, we also have Eddie Winter, a man who turned himself into a ghoul pre-war and locked himself in a bunker to survive, but he's remained locked in this bunker for 210 years as well, without the necessary food and water to survive. Contradicting both Billy the Ghoul Kid and Eddie Winter is the settlement building system, in which ghouls have a food and water requirement, and of particular note, robots don't have this requirement. Meaning this could have been changed if they intended ghouls to not need food or water. Further, there's both the Slog, which is a ghoul town where their whole thing is growing food in the old swimming pool, and there's Kent Connolly, a ghoul living in the Memory Den, where there's a terminal log saying that he spends most of his time in the pods, and he has to be taken out so he can get sustenance. That's just the base game, by the way. Fallout 4's awful DLC Nuka World has 2 additional examples of this conflict that also both conflict with each other. Oswald the Magical Ghoul has been living in the park for 200 years with a pack of feral ghouls without food, while at the same time, there's 2 ghoulified scientists who have been killed by the time you find them that had a plan for food that they used for years. They had a machine that essentially let them 3D print animals, which they used for food after the bombs dropped. That's just one of the lore issues, by the way. While I can't possibly know exactly what goes on behind closed doors at Bethesda, stuff like this tells me there is something very wrong going on behind the scenes. The occasional retcon can be excused as a simple mistake, something that slipped through the cracks, but having a piece of lore contradict itself numerous times across a single game and its DLC tells me either they're highly disorganized, they lack communication, or they don't care. And in Emil's case, it means he failed to do his job, either through incompetence or apathy. And we know, by the way, that the developers at Bethesda seem to just kinda do their own thing with very little oversight. Best faith assumption, it's simply a lack of communication, as isolated developers go off to do their own thing without consulting the lore or talking to each other, and either slips through the cracks, or ML, despite saying that discrepancies kill him, gives it a pass for some reason, despite the conflict and damage to the lore. Regardless of the cause, retcons like this are a problem because it destroys the lore and consistency of the series. This isn't an issue of 1 or 2 small discrepancies here and there. We're talking massive sweeping changes to established lore, characters, and parts of the world because someone at some stage of development seemingly just did something on their own, and there was no checks in place to ensure it was consistent with the rest of the game or franchise, and the lore master is an incompetent tool. Some people might view this as mean or unfair, but as a person whose job it is to keep the lore intact by ML's own words, every single retcon, inconsistency, and contradiction in the lore, both across the franchise since Bethesda has taken control, and those that exist within singular games they've made, are his responsibility and his fault for letting them ship. It is literally his job to prevent these issues, and the games still have them in droves. If you still think that it's unfair to lay blame upon him, then consider if he were instead responsible for your drinking water, and he had as many issues in water treatment as he does with video game development, and what the resultant consequence for such mistakes would be. Just because his job isn't something as important as making sure we have clean and safe drinking water, doesn't mean incompetence should be excused. While I did say before he should be fired, and I still believe that should be an option, at the very least he needs to be removed from having any say over lore, story, and writing on every level, and be replaced with someone who will actually stay true to what was there originally, and try to correct any lore issues in the future. This really shouldn't be that controversial of a statement. If someone is doing their job poorly, they should not continue to hold that position. Unfortunately, that seems very unlikely, as not only is he friends with Todd Howard, but also the fact that Bethesda seems to either double down every time they're called out for stuff like this, or, as we saw from an infamous encounter with Pete Hines, genuine concerns of lore breaks are dismissed as the franchise is treated as silly and stupid by the very people who are supposed to be taking care of it. Just for the sake of completeness, I'm going to run through a few more lore changes and retcons, just to make it clear that stuff like Kid in a Fridge isn't a one-off example of extreme lack of attention to the lore. Continuing on the point of ghouls needing food and water, This is something the Amazon show seems to get wrong as well. The ghoul was buried alive for a number of years, and it's explicitly stated that he's dug up once a year to have a body part cut off, meaning he'd have to survive for a year without food and water, and that's giving the benefit of the doubt that they'd feed him that once a year he's dug up, rather than just burying him again without food or water. Further still, we're shown that he does still drink and eat, meaning the show also contradicts itself on this issue as well. He even cannibalizes his friend like it's nothing. Thus, food is a necessity, something he says himself.
It ain't all canned peaches and marmalade left up here, sweetheart. Sometimes, a fella's gotta eat a fella.
Jet has been retconned to be a pre-war drug as of Fallout 4, where a terminal log related to a vault doing a test on drug addiction mentions there was a hidden stash of drugs in the vault that included Jet, meaning it's pre-war. Jet was not a drug pre-war. People defend this because Myron says some aspect of the drug's creation happened pre-war, but that was a side effect of feed given to livestock. Jet wasn't sold as a drug pre-war. This was also one of the issues Pete Hines dismissed on Twitter. As Myron explains it in-game, pre-war companies were experimenting with a cheap protein extract for growing food. The problem is that it got contaminated easily, and they had a ton of it contaminated. Rather than ditching it, they fed it to livestock. When Myron and the Mordinos were trying to come up with an addictive drug, they used fertilizer from Brahmin, then been fed this pre-war protein extract. The resulting fumes from the manure is what their slave workers were getting high off of, and that's how Jet was discovered. It was never a pre-war drug, until someone at Bethesda included it in a terminal log and in pre-war containers that made it pre-war. Now you have people mindlessly defending this change because they don't understand the lore at all, and for some reason feel the need to defend Bethesda from every criticism. In the Fallout show, not only has Shady Sands changed locations, but it was placed where the Boneyard, a completely different city, should be. Which should go without saying would have entirely changed how Shady Sands would have developed, especially considering the Master would have cracked their vault open and taken over their town. Two cities with two backstories dating back decades with lore of their own, disregarded for shock value in the show. You don't just retcon Peach's castle and put it in Bowser's castle and expect it to make sense. That is not how that works. Aliens having been made canon and given an awful DLC that's just 3 hours of shooting aliens in corridors, when aliens were only ever an Easter egg in the original game. There's also changes that aren't in the spirit of what was there originally, such as the Brotherhood being in West Virginia 25 years after the bombs dropped, when the original Brotherhood were isolationists, and Bethesda's excuse for this was they just had a satellite to communicate with people on the other side of the country and started a new chapter there. And to illustrate just how bad this problem is, I've mentioned already, Bethesda contradicts their own lore they themselves have created, with the easiest example being the case of 3 synths from Fallout 4. The short version is that the Institute, who live in a secret underground base, like to replace people on the surface with body double synths complete with memories of the person they're replacing, to act as spies or agents against those living on the surface. They need the memories of the person they're replacing, so the synth replacement won't be easily detected due to a lack of knowledge they should have. The game gives 2, technically 3 explanations for how this is done. The first is a brain scan, which seems straightforward in its presentation, a scan of the brain that essentially copies all memories and personality traits of the subject. There's no reason to not use this. The second is interrogations, which will certainly result in unreliable and incomplete information needed for the replacement. The final instance lacks an explanation entirely because the Institute just has a copy of this guy's memories and personality for no reason in particular, so you could see an encounter where he's holding his synth counterpart at gunpoint. I get they're doing the trope of 2 identical people fighting each other, so you don't know which is which, but this is nonsense given the information we've been shown and told. It breaks their own lore they created for this very same game. This obviously isn't a comprehensive list of all the retcons, contrivances, and lore breaks, but just a selection to prove the point. Actions speak louder than words. When Emil says that mistakes and discrepancies kill him, I simply just don't believe him, considering how many issues there are across Bethesda's Fallout games, and now the show as well. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that Fallout has effectively lost its identity at this point, due to Bethesda straying so far from what Fallout was. This isn't even counting what they've done to the Elder Scrolls either, by the way. This isn't even touching upon just how bad and shallow the writing is either, mind you, nor is it going into how the tone of the franchise has shifted radically, or other more subtle yet profound changes to the series. On that note, it is more than worth pointing out that neither Emil nor Todd Howard have ever understood Fallout from the very beginning.
You emerge from these vaults, and you don't know what's happened. So it's the optimism of this retro 50s world, and it's all destroyed. That people are still getting on. They're still trying to do their hair right, and if they had hairspray, they'd use it. It's like, you know what? Don't look at the destroyed crater and the smoking thing behind me. It's all cool, we'll have some cigars and martinis later.
That's what I love about Fallout. It doesn't take itself too seriously because the reality is so frightening and so depressing. It feels like you leave that vault, and the only thing you take with you is this piece of technology strapped to your wrist that becomes your sort of lifeline. It's that immersion thing. It's keeping you in the game.
These were the least qualified people to be working on Fallout back in 2008, and after 16 years of these clowns misunderstanding and not caring about the lore, it is in fucking shambles, with each new entry retconning or destroying major parts of the originals. The biggest faction appears to be completely destroyed, with a zero presence in the heart of their territory after one singular city was destroyed. And most people seem to think this is a silly, goofy, wacky series. These people have absolutely fucked Fallout into the dirt, and they don't fucking care, and are going to keep doing it as long as they hold the positions they do. The next thing I want to talk about here is his comment about how well the show captured the essence of Fallout. That is to say that it doesn't. Amazon's Fallout show is about as far away from Fallout as you can get, while still keeping the name and general iconography of the series. Unfortunately, it's becoming more and more common for people to claim that Fallout has always been silly and stupid and nonsensical. This is something that I need to discuss more and more, as the historical revisionism of this aspect seems to get worse by the day. But Fallout was not a goofy, wacky, silly series. People seem to treat it as though that it's an outright comedy, with people even saying that it's never been serious, that a darker Fallout wouldn't be Fallout.
A darker, deadpan, grounded Fallout game wouldn't be Fallout.
Getting real tired of tourist season. No offense, but you guys are lowering the bar.
While I mentioned it earlier, I'd like to remind people that Fallout was originally going to use the GURP system, and the creator of GURPS told them no, after seeing a cinematic where a power-armored soldier shot and killed an unarmed prisoner. Anyone who tells you that the original Fallout wasn't serious or dark is lying to you. Yes, it had humorous moments, it had silly Easter eggs, it even had a lot of humorous dialogue for a low-intelligence playthrough. But all of these were extremely rare and limited in nature. Having the occasional joke or rare Easter egg does not turn the entire franchise into a goofy nonsense comedy. I hate that I keep having to say this. It is frustrating to the nth fucking degree, because it seems to require an active disregard for how these games treated their stories and worlds, and how uncommon the jokes were. It'd be like if you turned Game of Thrones into Monty Python and the Holy Grail, because the occasional joke in Game of Thrones. The common defense to this criticism is to point out Fallout 2's sillier moments, and yes, that is a problem, but most of its silly elements are similarly relegated to random encounters, and none of that justifies this insane shift in tone we've seen, nor does it negate Fallout 2's own very dark tone, outside of those silly moments. Worse yet, I'd go so far as to argue that the show isn't even in line with the tone of Bethesda's Fallout games, let alone the originals. Yes, I'm actually going to go to bat for Bethesda's Fallout games here. Kinda. See, in comparison to the dark tone of the original games, Bethesda's Fallout games have a much lighter tone. This is one of many reasons I refer to these games as theme parks. It's a wild wasteland romp with lots of lighthearted or silly moments, and the dark tone is entirely superficial. Most of the struggles the characters face are either poorly thought out or are outright ridiculous. Two easy examples to use here are the towns of Little Lamplight and Big Town for separate reasons. Lamplight is absurd and ridiculous and nonsense, as it's a town populated entirely by children. Anyone who gets too old is expelled, with most going to Big Town. This seems like something that was done entirely for the gimmick. It's dumb and nonsensical. The back door of their base is made out of scrap wood, when their neighbors are super mutants, who are extremely physically strong on their own, on top of frequently having weapons such as rocket launchers that would make quick work of their weak wooden fence. The game also fails to explain where new children come from, when this is a town that's been populated entirely by children for 200 years. On the other side of this is Big Town, where the residents have no skills, have nothing of value to trade, have no source of food or water, and are frequently attacked by super mutants and slavers. They live in a desperate situation, but spend their days wandering around their small town idling, doing nothing at all, because there's nothing for them to do. A game that had some thought put into its world would have them attempting to do something, anything useful to survive. But because this is a nuclear wasteland theme park, and because it's a video game where NPCs don't actually require food and water to continue existing, the actual functions of how such a world would work are ignored and forgotten. Where a better game would have gone out of the way of both showing in-world design and telling through dialogue what they're doing on a daily basis to survive. They have no food source in a world where food is extremely scarce, and there are no farms, yet food doesn't seem to be a concern for them. You come to this town, do the one quest they have, then forget about them until your next playthrough because you've moved on to the next carnival game. This is a pretty sharp departure from the original games that generally treated their subject matter seriously, where the threats to the world, to the characters, and to factions were more than just superficial set dressing, like it is in Fallout 3 and 4. Thought and care was put into how this world would function and exist in the original games in New Vegas. Now obviously, this new tone isn't in line with the tone of the original games, but I'd argue the Fallout show still does a disservice to the tone of Fallout 3 and 4, where these games had a generally lighter tone and didn't take themselves too seriously. The Amazon Fallout show turns the entire setting into a complete and utter joke. Serious moments barely have time to breathe. You get new awful lore such as people working as shitters, who are fed a ton of food, so they'll shit to attract flies, which are then used for food, and you get constant forced, low-effort, unfunny Marvel humor jokes being spammed throughout the entire show, which is especially bad in the finale.
Is this where my dad's from?
You'll never find out. Oh, he's gonna find out.
To say the show captured the essence of Fallout is utterly insane, and seems completely out of touch with what Bethesda's own version of Fallout is, let alone the originals. Where the originals had a dark tone, and Bethesda's game had a lighter tone and felt like a theme park, Amazon's Fallout is an absolute unserious clown show. The last thing I want to tackle here with this set of tweets is his statement about how the show challenges us to question what it even means to be alive, and I'm just struggling to figure out what the fuck he's even referring to here. No aspect of the show's story or characters delve into such a subject of what it means to be alive at any point. The closest we get to this idea is two of the ghouls going feral, but that's extremely short-lived in both cases, and the show doesn't take time to consider this as a question of what it means to be alive. It seems to exist more so to put Lucy into the position of needing to defend herself, which she's already done numerous times by this point in the show. The last thing I want to talk about today are two articles, one from PC Gamer and one from Games Radar. Starting off, the Games Radar article says that ML is confident that Starfield is following the right trajectory. What trajectory would that be? Making more shallow, boring games with less RPG mechanics than your previous games? Where you're railroaded into extremely limited illusions of choice that don't really mean anything? where nothing you do matters. The writing quality certainly hasn't improved. This was the first game in its own new franchise with no prior lore to contradict, and they still managed to screw their own world and lore up. It also says something interesting, that Starfield was so poorly received. Popular opinion isn't something I normally take much stock in, because a lot of people liking or hating something doesn't necessarily mean that thing is good or bad. That said, it is an interesting metric here, as Bethesda has often had popular opinion on their side for many years through the declining quality of their games, and to see one of their games essentially get rejected by gamers at large kinda speaks to just how far they've fallen. Hype and nostalgia alone might not be enough to support them anymore.
In a lot of ways, Starfield is the hardest thing Bethesda has ever done. We pushed ourselves to make something totally different, to just jam into an Xbox the biggest, richest space simulation RPG anyone could imagine. That we pulled it off makes Starfield something of a technical marvel. It's also, in a lot of ways, the best game we've ever made. But for us, most importantly, Starfield has its own unique personality, and now sits right next to Fallout and Elder Scrolls.
This man might actually be delusional. The biggest, richest space simulation RPG anyone could imagine? He's saying this about Starfield, the space game where you can't actually travel in space. You just use UI in your ship to teleport to other planets. There is no traversing the deep, empty void of space in between planets and solar systems, because it doesn't exist. Everything you experience in space is while you're in orbit over a planet, because that's the only area in space that exists. This is an actual insult to space simulation games. Same for claiming it's the biggest and richest. Doing a quick search for other space simulation games, as of January 10th, 2023, exactly 236,219,997 unique star systems had been explored in the game Elite Dangerous, which is only 0.059% of the galaxy. And that's a game that is actual space travel, by the way. As for richest, Starfield impressively sets the bar so low that it'd be more of an achievement to be more shallow than Starfield. While I haven't completed research on the game for the full analysis I'm working on, I have played through the main story multiple times, as well as one of the side factions once, and all I see is one of the most shallow fictional worlds ever conceived of. Every time the opportunity comes up to explore some part of the world, or to add on to the lore, or add any depth to this universe, it gets squandered, ignored, or forgotten. Case in point, the Colony Wars. There's mention of mechs being used, but they were so destructive they were outlawed, so no one anywhere has mechs. Even the evil space pirates and other criminals politely obey the law in this matter, as criminals are so well known to do. It's like how levitation was outlawed in the Elder Scrolls, therefore all the evil mages, necromancers, and conjurers obey that law, while breaking dozens of others. There's more often than not the implication of greater things happening or existing within this universe, but we never get to see it. A screen cap of a YouTube comment was posted to my Discord server that perfectly describes how boring Starfield is as a setting. Corporate minimalist RPG. Can you think of a safer, more bland setting and lore? Oh, there were mechs in Xenowars, but that's over and illegal now. We had space zealots that were purging the galaxy, but they left now. Earth was going through an event that redefined life for the majority of humanity, but that happened a while ago. Your character was born just in time to roleplay as a space trucker or a geologist that could turn into Rick Sanchez. There's no bite, there's no depth, it's just generic sci-fi slop with no imagination behind it. Moving on, he says in a lot of ways it's the best game they've ever made. Okay, ML. In which ways is it the best game you've ever made? Because as far as I've seen, it might be one of their worst. The combat is worse than Fallout 4. The story is worse than anything they've done before. This game has the worst world building and characterization of any game they've done. They've got spaceships working, which is admittedly a marvel for Bethesda, but otherwise is nothing new or innovative. They added Skyrim dragon shouts for your Starborn character. The attempt at a story involving a multiverse is pathetic. In fact, the main story overall is easily the worst one they've written, and while I haven't completed research for the analysis video I'm working on, the side factions aren't looking so hot either. What with the pirate faction who tells you there's no quitting or retiring, the only way out is death, then they go on to fire someone because you snitched on them. Totally ignoring the retired Crimson Cringe pirate in Constellation for the main quest too, by the way. But for us, most importantly, Starfield has its own unique personality, and now sits right next to Fallout and Elder Scrolls. He later adds, Bethesda used to feel like the studio of Elder Scrolls, then it was the studio you'd associate with Elder Scrolls and Fallout. Now it's Elder Scrolls, Fallout, and Starfield, Bethesda Game Studios' Big Three. I guess the most bland, boring, and uninteresting setting to ever be created is technically a personality. It sits right next to Fallout and Elder Scrolls. I'd be surprised if this piece of shit game ever has any kind of sequel. Normally DLC drops raise player numbers, but it just didn't happen with Starfield. It's dead, Jim. Most of this comes across as PR speak to me. Not to imply that I think he'd shit-talk his own work, just in the sense that it's kind of his job to publicly boost his product. That said, it's kind of hard to ignore the fact that Starfield is their most poorly received game by the general public, and the fact that there's good reason for that. It's just not a very good game by any metric, and the DLC doesn't help that image either. I've completed the main story of Shattered Space, and it's just more of the same as base game Starfield. Bland environments, boring characters, and awful writing. Let me just give a quick example. Early on in the questline, you're sent to save some members of House of Varun from the Zealots who are holed up in a dungeon. As you're on your way to go do so, an enforcer working for the chick who gave you the mission talks to you and says it would be better if you would just kill the hostages, because as it turns out, this sub-house was vying for power over the others, and these hostages have information that could expose them. See the problem? You're a new recruit to the stupid snake cult faction, the first in generations, and you're recruited to help solve this problem they're having. And one of the first quests you can do in the main story of this DLC, the second in command to one of the big three houses within House Varun, is exposing to you that they were making a power play. One where they wanted you to kill people with knowledge that could expose them, while at the same time exposing the fact that they're making a power play to you. It's not an exaggeration to say that this game just isn't good, and while they apparently did try to course correct with the DLC, so far as making some handcrafted content, it just feels like more of the same because, well, it is. The Proc-Gen universe was only a fraction of the problem. A big part of the fraction, don't get me wrong, but it by far wasn't the biggest issue Starfield had. The biggest issues are the awful writing across the board, in the bland and boring universe. Going back to those comments he made, this also very much comes across as cope. It seems like they desperately want Starfield to be big, and it hasn't reached that mark, but if they assert it enough, then maybe it will be one of Bethesda's big three. This makes me wonder how much of Bethesda's trajectory in making worse and worse games is due to ignoring criticism and delusion due to lying to themselves. They've seemingly had success after success after success, and paid little or no attention to the criticism they receive each time.
Is waiting for reviews to come in, right? And then reading the reviews, of course, and hopefully, if you get lucky, ignoring the reviews, right?
And have gotten into the habit of sniffing their own farts, and failing to realize the shortcomings of their games, as they seem to double down each time, only to finally land on Starfield being their most poorly performing game, and most poorly received game by general audiences. It really comes across as though Bethesda is insulated from criticism of their games. It's like they're flying blind, and as long as they don't crash, then all is good. Starfield should be the pull-up warning for them, and judging from Shattered Space, they're ignoring that warning while heading straight towards a mountain. ML later says that during Fallout 3, they found out that players didn't like that the game had a hard ending, and that the experience should never end, and that they should make the content work together as seamlessly as they can, and that this was a pivotal moment for them. This is a prime example of taking the wrong lesson from something. Yes, there were many people who were upset at the hard ending, likely because Bethesda's previous games didn't have hard endings, but I suspect the problem is deeper than that. See, New Vegas also had a hard ending, and while I'm sure there's people who don't like that either, which one of these two having a hard ending did you hear more about? Fallout 3. Even well over a decade later, I still see Fox refusing to turn on the purifier, being criticized on Twitter every other month, whereas I barely ever hear anyone refer to the hard ending of New Vegas being a bad thing. There's a few major contributing factors to why I believe people hated that Fallout 3 had a hard ending and didn't mind it with New Vegas. First of all, most quests in New Vegas were related to the factions vying for control of the Mojave. What, are you going to help the NCR kill the leaders of the Fiends after you've helped House win the Battle of Hoover Dam? Fallout 3 has no such connection between its side quests and its main story. In fact, all of the side quests are completely irrelevant to and disconnected from the main story, and can be completed totally in isolation from it. Next is the issue already mentioned. You've got two companions who are immune to radiation, one of which is actually healed by it, and is a mind slave to you and has to obey your orders, and they still both refuse to turn it on, with Fox infamously stating that he will not deny you your destiny to go into the water purifier and die horribly for no reason. Additionally, New Vegas would require a lot of work to reflect the changes that would happen depending on which side won the battle, as opposed to Fallout 3, which, while it still required a bit of work, it was not nearly as extensive, as we've seen from the changes to the world based on your choice in Broken Steel. I also think it's not telegraphed well enough in advance that this would be a hard ending in the base game, which I'm sure threw many people off. This isn't counting, by the way, how extremely contrived and poorly written everything is surrounding this moment. Now, as for taking the wrong lesson from this moment, it seems as though this might have been what led to their current design philosophy, where you can experience pretty much everything on a single playthrough, and there's generally a lack of choice and consequences in their games, and they never end no matter what. Now, I don't have any particularly strong feelings one way or the other on whether these games should have a hard ending. I'd say it depends on whether the story being told calls for it or not, and how well it's done, and if the developers are even able to do the work necessary to properly portray any necessary changes to the world after the story. This mindset does, however, preclude Bethesda from ever doing a story that might be necessary to have a hard ending, which I think is a bit limiting in terms of the stories you can tell. The sacrifice the Lone Wanderer makes at the end of Fallout 3 isn't bad because it results in the game ending, it's bad because it's absurdly contrived and extremely poorly written. I feel like this is something of a contributing factor to the shallowness in the world and lore that I think is bad for these games, as well as why the general blandness seems to be getting worse with each game. People have mocked for years the fact that you can be the Archmage of the College of Winterhold, you could be the leader of the Companions, Thieves Guild, and Dark Brotherhood, all at the same time, and sell your soul to about a dozen different Daedric lords, and there's little to no accounting for it in-universe. I don't even mind the idea of the player becoming the leader of all the factions, if at least there is a bit more depth to it, and the world responded to it in some way. Instead, it feels like most quest lines and even individual quests exist in a bubble, entirely isolated from every other part of the world. In Morrowind, you could get locked out of entire factions and their quest lines for joining an opposing faction, or doing a quest for another faction that would negatively impact a guild you might want to join. Stuff like this adds not just replayability to the game, but also substantive consequences for your actions, and there hasn't really been anything like that in Bethesda's games since Morrowind. Even in Fallout 4, where you have the chance to join 4 factions for the main story, you can do most of their quests before you hit the point of no return, and even then, the Minutemen are just kinda chill with everyone, so you don't even lose their quests if you side with any of the other 3 factions. Bethesda aiming for this inoffensive experience with no bite or edge to it, where the player almost never has to suffer any significant consequence for their actions, where you can never get locked out of any quest line, and where nothing really matters, is a big part of why these worlds they make feel so empty and lifeless. Morrowind, despite being a game where NPC AI is limited to standing in place forever, or wandering aimlessly in a 5-meter area feels more alive and immersive than these games where NPCs have schedules, because the quest lines would intersect with one another in a way that made sense. There were acknowledgements that the rest of the world existed, whereas the games that came later treat their factions as though they're totally isolated from one another and the rest of the world. Rather than feeling like you're in an immersive, interconnected world, it feels more like the world is little more than a single-player lobby where you go decide to do a questline or individual side quest that exist and were created in total isolation from each other and the rest of the world, and from pre-established lore as well. This is especially true for Skyrim and Starfield, though it absolutely applies to Fallout 3 and 4 as well. What I'm essentially getting from this statement, as well as seeing how Bethesda games have progressed since Morrowind, is that this isn't a company that likes to take risks. They like playing it safe. Far, far too safe, to the point there's little substance to the stories they try to tell and the worlds they try to portray. That and that established history and lore is just an afterthought at best and an inconvenience at worst. Bethesda seems to have changed their entire methodology from a gold standard of writing and player freedom to a corporate outlook where everyone needs their hands held. The player can never have any true consequences for their actions, and the story is more reliant on random set pieces that rarely take the world or reality into account, instead operating off of a rule of cool with little to no substance or actual thought for the world or lore. Moving on, Emil then talks about the process of making the DLC, and how it becomes its own thing as you work on it. It exists in its own pocket of awesome outside of comparison to something else. And when that happens, that's when you dive in, fully committed to the vision, and your gut is just telling you it's going to be good because it was made with so much passion. This is part of what I mean when I say delusional, by the way. I really don't mean to come across as an asshole when I say this, but what else can I really say when it appears they're hyping themselves up this much over some of the most bland and boring content I've ever seen? That they're running purely on good vibes, as opposed to paying attention to their craft. They're literally telling themselves that what they're doing is good just because they're passionate about it, while still making utter garbage. You can be passionate about cooking, and still manage to be so bad at it that you burn every meal. One last side note on this article is that the writer claims that Skyrim's towns and dungeons had depth, which is pretty laughable. Now that was an article that was released prior to Shattered Space. The next and final thing I'm covering in this video is an article by PC Gamer after the release of Starfield's awful DLC. The first thing to take note of is Emil saying he's proud of Shattered Space, but no one is patting themselves on the back while ignoring the players. I suppose there's a first time for everything. I have no hope of this being a wake-up call for Bethesda, as much as I desperately need one. Their whole MO for years seems to have been ignoring player feedback and criticism. Do I have to reference the infamous exchange with Pete Hines again about Jet and ghouls in Fallout 4? How about people being heavily against paid mods on Steam, only for Bethesda to revive the idea, rebranded to the Creation Club, which they've since added to Starfield itself. This is a company that just seems to do whatever it wants regardless of how their fans feel. In fact, that seems to be the central point of this article, that a Twitter user responded to Emil, saying that it seems as though the developers at Bethesda just ignore feedback and criticism, and doubled down on unpopular decisions regarding the games they make. As someone who has been a fan of Bethesda games for most of my life, and watching the constant downward spiral in terms of quality of writing, and RPG mechanics and depth, and quality of the world building, and having seen other people voice such concerns for years, it does very much feel like Bethesda is ignoring their fans. They dumb these games down and sand off the edges, seemingly to appeal to a wider market, and while there's nothing wrong with wanting to have more customers, the cost with Bethesda's methods result in the quality of their games dropping hard, and fans feeling like they're being ignored. Once again, the end result is a bland, boring game with no personality, and the writing and world building have more holes than a goddamn screen door. In fact, that's likely a big part of the root cause of Bethesda's games getting worse and worse. As their games have become more accessible to a wider audience, they've gained a much bigger casual audience. The kinds of people who don't delve too deeply into the content they consume and just use it as entertainment to pass the time. When core fans criticize Bethesda's failures, it's likely an issue of Bethesda dismissing those criticisms and complaints as being a vocal minority. Bethesda is looking no further than the bottom line of how much money each game makes them, how well their games sell, while failing to address the genuine concerns of the core audience of their games. After all, if it's only a few people complaining, and not the majority of players, then surely it's not an issue, right? Well, that's just it. Not every person who has a problem is necessarily going to voice those complaints. In fact, it's the minority of people who have issues in the first place that will voice them. For every customer that makes a complaint, how many are simply just walking away silently? Dozens? Hundreds? Thousands? How many aren't walking away now, but will next time? It doesn't seem to matter to Bethesda as long as the fans walking away are replaced with new fans, but how many of those fans are going to be a core audience and not just a casual gamer? Getting back on track, in response to the thread, Emil had said that he's sometimes asked or told to do interviews, and that he's a pretty optimistic and excitable person about games, also adding that it's not meant to be mud in the eye of dissatisfied fans. There's obviously nothing wrong with being optimistic and excitable, but it is absolutely worth asking at what point does it stop being simple optimism, and when does it start becoming delusion? At what point have you gotten so high off of your own hype that you fail to see the shortcomings in the products you're making? This is especially true for something like Starfield, where the writing is some of the worst I've seen in a game, and the world is bland and boring in pretty much every way. How do you play this boring-ass game with utterly lazy scripted sequences, full of holes in these lame-ass twists and awful conclusion, and think that this is the next big gaming franchise that millions of people will love? It's like making Kraven the Hunter or Morbius or Madam Web.
He was in the Amazon with my mom when she was researching spiders right before she died.
And thinking they're going to be profitable and highly successful movies. I think the biggest problem here is the lack of acknowledgement of a problem even existing in most cases, and the doubling down as mentioned. Fallout 3 made some pretty egregious changes to lore, characters, and factions, only for Fallout 4 to be even more damaging to the lore, only for Fallout 76 to be even more damaging to the lore, only for the Fallout show to completely and utterly destroy nearly every piece of lore that hadn't yet been ruined. When you're a fan who actually gives a damn about the consistency of the world, lore, characters, and stories being told, stuff like this absolutely feels like Bethesda is ignoring criticism and just doing whatever. Sure, they've addressed the lack of handcrafted content in Starfield by making a DLC that is largely handcrafted, but at this point, it's a drop of water in an ocean of piss. This handcrafted island of content isn't really any different from any of the other handcrafted islands of content in the base game. Ignoring that, as far as writing and world building goes, it's still more of the same. So where's the acknowledgement that the writing is god-awful? Emil apparently said that there's not a bug or issue with the game that Bethesda as a whole isn't aware of. So, you're aware of all the writing problems and plot holes this game has? Are you going to try to do better next time? What about Fallout and Elder Scrolls, since one of those is likely to be your next game? Will you continue retconning the lore on a whim because you don't want to be beholden to something someone wrote 20 years ago? Or are you going to make an effort to stay consistent with the lore? If I had to bet, I know where I'd put my money, and it wouldn't be on Bethesda actually improving. In fact, they seem to wholly lack the ability to improve, which is genuinely unfortunate. Moving along, there's a mention that most of the DLC was made by Bethesda veterans, some of which have been with the company since Morrowind, to which my response is, okay, and your point is? Again, having completed the DLC, I was neither hooked nor engaged nor interested in anything that happened, but I did find many things to be issues, such as the general lack of choice, or the fact that you can shit-talk their religion, going so far as to claim to be their god to their leader, only for no one to really care. In fact, the whole DLC was a mess from start to finish. It feels exactly as lame, boring, empty, and shallow as the rest of Starfield. There's also a mention that it makes him sad that people don't like it, but
just know that we've also been hearing from plenty of people who love it.
aside from literal shills and diehard Bethesda fans who are going to like anything Bethesda does without question, who are the people who really love this DLC? It's got a mostly negative rating on Steam, with a whopping 70% of people leaving a negative review at the time of writing the script for this video. I also wonder what the point of throwing this in is. Is it simply PR? Or is it a way of saying that because they see plenty of people liking it, that they must be doing something right? I don't know. Maybe it's just personal cope. We then get to the quote in the headline of the article.
Maybe it's a game of expectations. Fans want a lot, and we do all we can to accommodate them. Here's what I can tell you. Nobody, and I mean nobody at Bethesda, is patting themselves on the back while ignoring our players. In addition to Shattered Space, we've also spent a lot of time this year addressing community concerns and making fixes. We'll continue to do so, and we'll be listening to our fans every step of the way. We make these games for all of you.
A game of expectations? And whose fault is that when Bethesda hypes up each release of their games to be the second coming, only to actually release a far less than mediocre product? Also, I can say personally that it's not a game of expectations because my expectations were rock bottom, and Starfield still managed to be disappointing.
I expect nothing, and I'm still let down.
Oftentimes, fans expect what you build them up to expect. When you tell them your game is the second coming, only for it to be another lackluster, boring, shallow, hollow, empty mess, that's naturally going to leave your fans disappointed. And some fans, like myself, will start to become jaded and not trust you anymore. When I went into EB Games one day and saw a new game called Fallout 3 on the shelf, I saw the Bethesda logo and bought it on that alone without a second thought. Here I am 16 years later, having lost all trust and faith in Bethesda ever making a good game again, after experiencing disappointment after disappointment. I'm not a Bethesda hater, as some would like to label me. I'm a former Bethesda fan who still loves the Elder Scrolls and Fallout, and wants to see them be good again, and I get frustrated knowing that will likely never happen, knowing that Bethesda refuses to change for the better, that they only seem to get more lazy with each game they make, knowing they've done so much damage to their reputation and tone of Fallout that people think it's nothing but a goofy, wacky, silly post-apocalypse with no serious storytelling. So even if Microsoft takes Fallout away from Bethesda and gives it to one of their other developers, they'll likely be building upon the rotten foundation that Bethesda has supplanted the originals with. And as for ML saying that they're listening to fans every step of the way, I just don't believe him or Bethesda at this point. Unfortunately for Bethesda, Starfield is too much of a mess to actually fix. The problems are far too deep and foundational to fix in some patches. We're talking a complete rework from the ground up. Stuff like it supposedly being a space sim, where there is no actual space travel. Stuff like it being a space exploration game, with pretty much nothing to explore. Stuff like the entire story revolving around a multiverse, except the universe is an identical copy of itself in every alternate universe you go to, aside from the very rare gimmick universes. Starfield was a broken idea from its foundation, and nothing can truly fix it. If Bethesda really wants to address player feedback and concerns, they should come out and address them properly. None of this Mickey Mouse bullshit of coming up with excuses or trying to justify their mistakes, like they did with adding the Brotherhood to Fallout 76, or nuking Shady Sands before New Vegas in the show. Address the issues, make corrections, admit fault where it exists, declare 76 non-canon, give your word to fans to do better for future games, and actually put in the effort to write good, consistent stories. No more of this paper plane shit. And I'm sorry, but ML really does need to be removed from having anything to do with lore or writing. The guy is not cut out for it, as is clearly and easily evidenced by his work on Fallout 3's main story, Fallout 4's main story, Starfield's main story, Skyrim's Dark Brotherhood, and yes, even Oblivion's Dark Brotherhood. The contract quests for Oblivion's Dark Brotherhood are fine, but the actual story is awful.
But as a hardcore gamer myself, who often encounters issues with other devs' games that I love, I know it sucks when it's an issue that is affecting you personally and making the game less fun. Seriously, that kills me. I wish we could auto-magically address everything.
It apparently kills him, but despite being criticized for years for being a bad writer, he seemingly hasn't taken any steps to improve his writing.
Is waiting for reviews to come in, right? And then reading the reviews, of course, and hopefully, if you get lucky, ignoring the reviews, right?
Issues that make the game less fun kills him, but he ignores criticism, meaning everyone who is saying his writing is bad is being ignored, meaning he isn't improving his writing, meaning the bad writing will be making the games less fun for a lot of people. Anyone surprised by Starfield's poor performance with audiences wasn't paying attention. With the direction Bethesda has been going, this was inevitable. Now, one last point I want to make here is that while ML is a problem, he isn't the only problem. If he were to retire or be reassigned or be fired or whatever tomorrow, the quality of Bethesda's games won't magically improve overnight. ML appears to be a symptom of a much larger and widespread problem at Bethesda, whatever that may be. It's hard to tell from the outside and running on what few scraps of information we get, but there seems to be something seriously wrong with the company culture around game development there, where developers seemingly go off to make random quests with little to no oversight, thus explaining why so many instances of attempts at world building or storytelling that fall flat or have little to no depth or are contradicted by other parts of the game. This might also explain why lore gets contradicted so often. At the end of the day, when I make all these videos criticizing Bethesda, there is just one thing I want. For their games to be better. Better written, more consistent, accurate to the lore, not undermining and destroying the lore and worlds and franchises that I love so much. But that's all for today. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe and check out some of my other videos, such as my full breakdown of the Fallout show, or my extensive analysis of Fallout 4. I also stream games often. I'm currently working on an extensive and in-depth analysis of Starfield, as well as various other video projects. Once again, thank you for watching.